Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is a fundamental expectation of precision. Like, it feels kind of like engineering.
Right, it's very clinical.
Yeah, exactly. You break your arm, you go to the hospital, and the x-ray shows that jagged, undeniable white line. And the doctor just points to the screen and says, well, there it is. That's the problem.
It's completely binary. I mean, it's either broken or it's not. And frankly, that is a really comforting way to view the world. We crave that kind of visibility, you know? We want to be able to categorize things neatly into little boxes.
But the second you step into the world of human behavior, that x-ray machine just shatters. We are suddenly looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely invisible.
You really can't put a social dynamic under a microscope.
No, you can't. And today, we're taking a massive journey through Unit 14 of Myers Psychology for AP, and we are exploring the absolute depths of social psychology.
We're looking at those unseen threads that connect every single one of us.
Right. Our mission for this deep dive is to act as your personal tutors, breaking down how we think about each other, how we influence each other, and how we relate to one another. You are going to ace this material because we are going to break it all down together.
And to really understand why this entire field of study even exists, we kind of have to confront a profound, almost jarring duality in human nature.
The absolute extremes, right?
Exactly. The extremes of what we're capable of as a species.
Let's ground this right away with the paradox the source material uses to open the entire discussion. September 11, 2001.
Yeah, it's a heavy example.
It is. On that Tuesday morning, 19 men with box cutters committed acts of just catastrophic, unthinkable violence. They hijacked commercial airliners and murdered thousands of innocent people. It was an act driven by an intense, calculated hatred.
A horrifying display of, the darkest capabilities of human behavior.
But simultaneously, literally in the exact same moments, in the exact same city, that identical event triggered an incomprehensible outpouring of heroic altruism.
The contrast is just staggering.
It really is. You had first responders and just ordinary civilians sacrificing their own lives to save complete strangers in the stairwells of those towers.
And in the days following, people from all over the country flooded New York with more money and food and clothing.
Yeah, even teddy bears. More than the city could ever possibly process.
Which really forces us to ask the ultimate question of social psychology. What is actually driving our social behavior?
Right. How can the exact same human brain be wired for both calculated, devastating destruction and entirely selfless heroism?
Whether we are analyzing geopolitical tragedies like the violence in Darfur or the war in Iraq, or simply looking at the tribalism of how voters aligned behind Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, or John McCain back in the 2008 election, our entire existence revolves around these invisible social forces.
They're constantly pulling on these threads, and usually without even realizing it. So let's start making the invisible visible. The first major pillar here is social thinking, or social cognition.
At its core, this is really about how our brains try to explain the behavior of the people around us.
Because we are obsessed with being detectives, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely.
If a coworker walks into the office 20 minutes late, our brain immediately demands an explanation. Like, are they just a lazy person who doesn't respect our time? Or did they get stuck behind a severe car accident on the highway?
We simply cannot tolerate ambiguity when it comes to human behavior. And this compulsion brings us to the work of Fritz Heider.
Okay, so what did he figure out?
Well, he developed what is known as attribution theory. Heider proposed a remarkably simple framework for this whole detective work thing.
Basically how we assign blame or credit.
Right, exactly. When we attempt to explain someone else's behavior, we essentially force it into one of two categories. We either attribute it to their internal disposition, meaning their enduring personality traits, their character, who they are at their core.
Or we attribute it to the external situation.
Right, meaning the environment, the stress of the moment, the context they're operating within.
So it's dispositional attribution versus situational attribution.
Precisely. To use a classroom example, if a student is suddenly hostile and lashing out at a teacher, the teacher's brain immediately tries to solve the puzzle.
Right. The teacher wants to know why.
Is this student inherently aggressive and rebellious? That would be a dispositional attribution. Or is this student currently experiencing abuse or intense stress at home, and the hostility is just a reaction to that specific environment?
And that would be the situational attribution. I mean, I understand the categories, but human beings are incredibly flawed detectives.
Very flawed.
We are massively biased in how we actually assign these attributions. And this introduces a really foundational concept for our discussion, which is the fundamental attribution error.
This is a huge one.
It is. It's our overwhelming tendency when we are judging other people to overestimate the influence of their personality and completely underestimate the power of the situation.
We are practically blind to the context of other people's lives. We see a quiet classmate sitting in the back of the room, and our brain immediately locks them into a dispositional box. We say, oh, they're a shy, introverted person.
We don't even consider that maybe they are just tired or dealing with something personal, or maybe they're just intimidated by that specific class.
Right, but then you see that exact same classmate performing as the energetic lead in the school musical. The situation changed, and their behavior completely transformed.
But our initial instinct was still to define their entire character based on that one narrow observation in the classroom.
Exactly.
It makes me think of an analogy. It's like looking at a car stuck in deep mud on the side of the road and the tires are just spinning. Because of the fundamental attribution error, we look at the car and say, wow, what a terrible weak engine. That car is useless.
You're blaming the internal mechanics of the car.
Exactly. We entirely failed to realize that the mud is 3 feet deep. We are completely blind to the mud.
That is the perfect visual. The mud is the situation, the engine is the disposition, and we almost always blame the engine.
Always.
There is a brilliant, almost frustrating study from 1979 by Deindividuation and George Goethals that demonstrates just how stubborn this cognitive blindness really is.
I love this study because of how irrational the participants act. So let me set it up for you. The researchers had college students come in and talk one-on-one with a young woman. Now, this woman is a Confederate, which means she's essentially an actor working for the researchers.
Right, she's in on it.
Half the time, she is instructed to act incredibly warm, friendly, and engaging. The other half of the time, she is instructed to be aloof, critical, and frankly, kind of mean.
So her behavior is entirely manufactured. It is purely situational, completely dictated by the rules of the experiment.
Exactly. Now, for the first group of students, the researchers said nothing beforehand. They just let them talk to her.
Yeah.
But for the second group, the researchers told them the absolute, unvarnished truth before they even walked in the room.
They gave away the secret.
They did. They explicitly said, listen, the woman you're about to talk to is part of the experiment. She's been instructed to act either friendly or unfriendly. Her behavior is an act.
Now, rationally, you would expect that second group to factor the mud into their evaluation, right?
You'd think so.
You would expect them to say, well, she was acting cold, but I know she was told to do that, so I can't really judge her actual personality.
But the human brain completely ignored the warning. Like the information had literally zero effect on their final judgments.
Done it all.
When the students rated her personality afterward, if she acted friendly, they concluded she was genuinely a warm person. If she acted unfriendly, they insisted she was fundamentally a cold person.
Even when they possessed the explicit factual knowledge that her behavior was a situational act, their brains still defaulted to a dispositional attribution.
It's exactly like watching an actor play a vicious villain in a movie, knowing full well they are reading a script written by someone else and still hating the actor in real life when you see them at a grocery store.
Yeah.
We just cannot separate the action from the essence of the person.
It is a profound cognitive blind spot. But here's where the mechanics get even more interesting. We do this to other people, but what happens when we evaluate ourselves?
Well, the rules completely change.
They really do. This brings us to the actor-observer difference. When we are the observer, when we're watching someone else, our camera is pointed outward at them. We don't see their past, their stress, or their lack of sleep.
We just see their isolated action in that moment.
Yeah.
So we make a dispositional attribution.
Right. But when we are the actor in our own lives, the camera is pointed outward at our environment. We are intimately aware of our own mud. We know we slept terribly. We know we just got a bad grade.
So when we snap at a friend, we blame the situation. We say, I only yelled because I'm exhausted.
But when then someone else yells at us, they are a toxic, angry person.
It is the ultimate double standard. Though we should note an important cultural caveat here. The fundamental attribution error is not a universal human absolute.
Yeah.
It is heavily influenced by culture.
That's a great point.
It is particularly rampant in individualistic Western cultures, like the United States, where we are taught from a young age that individuals are solely responsible for their destinies.
And if you look at many East Asian cultures, which are much more collectivist, people are actually much more sensitive to the power of the situation and the surrounding social context.
That cultural distinction is vital because these attributions aren't just theoretical parlor tricks. They actively construct our political and social realities.
Absolutely. Just think about how a society explains systemic issues like poverty or unemployment.
Right. Political conservatives often lean heavily toward dispositional attributions. They might argue that social problems are the result of personal failings, like a lack of initiative, laziness, or bad personal choices. The underlying philosophy is often that people get what they deserve based on their internal character.
On the flip side, political liberals, along with most social scientists, are much more likely to make situational attributions. They look at the mud.
They point to historical and present environments. Things like underfunded educational systems, generational lack of opportunity, systemic discrimination.
And when it comes to something as extreme as terrorism, a dispositional approach might say, these are inherently evil people who must be destroyed.
Right, but a situational approach, as summarized by the material, argues that you have to analyze the environments that breed radicalization. It's the idea of draining the swamps rather than just swatting the mosquitoes. Our initial cognitive attribution completely dictates our proposed real-world solutions.
Exactly. Our private thoughts dictate public policy, which naturally leads us into the friction between our attitudes and our actions. We just established how our judgments shape our worldview, but how do we actually change those attitudes?
An attitude, psychologically speaking, is a feeling, which is often heavily influenced by our underlying beliefs, that predisposes how we react to objects, people, or events.
So give me an example of that.
Well, if I believe climate change is an existential threat, my attitude toward gas-guzzling vehicles will be intensely negative, right? And that predisposes me to vote for environmental regulations.
And researchers have identified two primary pathways to persuade someone and actually alter those attitudes. The first is central root persuasion.
Okay, what does that look like?
This occurs when people are actively engaged in the issue and naturally analytical. You present them with robust scientific evidence, logical arguments, and data.
Right. The classic example in the text is Al Gore's documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. It laid out systematic, data-driven arguments about climate change.
And because it engaged the analytical mind, the resulting attitude changes were highly durable. It actually caused major corporations and individuals to permanently alter their environmental behaviors.
But we aren't always analytical. In fact, most of the time, our brains are lazy. And that is where peripheral root persuasion comes in.
This happens when the issue doesn't trigger deep, systematic thinking. Instead of evaluating logic, people rely on incidental, surface-level cues.
Like seeing a gorgeous celebrity endorsing a luxury watch, or a political candidate standing in front of a giant waving flag with dramatic music playing in the background. It triggers a fast, emotional snap judgment.
The catch is, because peripheral persuasion relies on superficial cues rather than deeply processed logic, the resulting attitude change is usually fragile and temporary.
Now, both of those routes operate on a very logical, intuitive assumption. And that assumption is that our attitudes dictate our actions. I believe X, therefore I do Y.
Right. It's a one-way street. Belief comes first, behavior follows.
But here's one of the most counterintuitive, paradigm-shifting discoveries in all of social psychology. The street goes both ways.
It really does.
And sometimes the traffic is actually heavier in the opposite direction. Sometimes our actions dictate our attitudes.
The physical behavior actually manufactures the internal belief. The principle is basically doing becomes believing.
This brings us to the foot in the door phenomenon. And the historical case study for this is genuinely chilling. During the Korean War, Chinese communists ran intense thought control programs on captured United States soldiers.
And obviously, if you want to brainwash an enemy soldier into abandoning their deeply held patriotism and adopting communism, the instinct is to use brutal physical torture to force a confession.
Right, break them down.
But the Chinese interrogators understood psychology better than that. They knew that forced compliance doesn't change internal attitudes. If you hold a gun to someone's head and make them say, "I love communism," they don't actually believe it.
The moment the gun is gone, the belief vanishes.
Exactly. So they didn't start with a gun. They started with the absolute smallest, most trivial requests imaginable. That is the foot in the door.
Wait, let me push back on this a little. You're telling me you can deconstruct someone's entire political and moral ideology just by asking them to do small favors?
I know, it sounds crazy.
How does sweeping a floor translate to abandoning capitalism? That seems like a massive illogical leap.
It seems illogical until you understand how the brain rationalizes its own behavior. The interrogators would ask a POWs to perform a tiny, seemingly harmless task, maybe run a small errand, or accept a minor privilege.
Okay, so just a tiny physical action.
Then they escalate slightly. They ask the soldier to copy down a trivial, non-controversial statement. Then, maybe a week later, they ask them to write a statement that points out a minor, obvious flaw in capitalist societies. Something really benign like, yes, there is poverty in America.
I see. It's an imperceptible slope.
Exactly. Once you write that down, you are publicly committing to an action. Then they ask you to participate in a group discussion about what you just wrote.
So they keep stepping it up.
At every tiny step, the soldier's brain has to justify the action. They think, well, I wrote it down, it wasn't a big deal, maybe I actually agree with a little bit of it. By coaxing them into a series of escalating physical actions, the prisoners gradually adjusted their private attitudes to align with their public behavior.
And it was incredibly effective. The text notes that when the war ended, 21 American prisoners willingly chose to remain with the communists, and many others returned home fundamentally convinced that communism was a superior system for Asia.
They didn't just comply. Their core beliefs were entirely rewritten by their actions.
It is terrifying how malleable we are. But this mechanism doesn't just apply to geopolitical brainwashing. It happens right in our own driveways.
Oh, the yard signs study.
Yes. There's a classic, almost comedic experiment where researchers posed as safe driving volunteers in California. They knocked on doors and asked homeowners if they could install a massive, poorly lettered, obnoxiously ugly drive, carefully signed, right in the middle of their beautiful front lawns.
Unsurprisingly, only 17% of people said yes. It's just an unreasonable request.
But they tested a different approach on a second group of homeowners. With the second group, they started incredibly small. They just asked them to display a tiny, innocuous 3-inch sign in their window that said, "Be a safe driver."
It was such a small request that almost everyone agreed.
But here's the psychological trap. 2 weeks later, the researchers came back to those exact same people and hit them with the massive, ugly yard sign request. And suddenly, an astonishing 76% of them said yes.
And the only difference between the two groups was that initial 3-inch sign.
Right. By agreeing to the small action, the homeowners unconsciously shifted their own internal identity. They started viewing themselves as the kind of person who actively supports safe driving initiatives.
Once their self-concept changed, the massive, ugly sign no longer felt like an intrusion. It felt like a natural extension of who they had become.
Which perfectly transitions into the power of role-playing. When you step into a new role in life, maybe you get your first real corporate job, or you get married, or you become a parent. At first, it feels completely unnatural.
You feel like an imposter.
Yeah, you were just play acting the role of a business professional. You were faking it.
But you can't fake it forever. Eventually, the psychological boundary between the act and reality dissolves. What began as a costume basically becomes your actual skin. And the most infamous demonstration of this is Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment.
This one is legendary.
Zimbardo built a simulated prison right in the basement of the Stanford Psychology building. He took a group of totally normal, psychologically healthy male college students, flipped a coin, and randomly assigned them to play the role of either a guard or a prisoner.
He gave the guards mirrored sunglasses, khaki uniforms, nightsticks, and whistles. He stripped the prisoners, gave them humiliating smocks with numbers instead of names, and locked them in barren cells. He basically built a theatrical sage.
For the first day or two, everyone was just awkwardly self-conscious. They knew they were just college kids in a basement playing a game.
But then the roles consumed them. The simulation became their absolute reality.
It really did. The guards began to develop genuinely disparaging attitudes toward the prisoners. They devised cruel, degrading, and exhausting routines.
And the prisoners, in turn, either broke down completely, rebelled violently, or just became apathetically submissive. The students literally lost their real identities to the roles they were assigned.
It escalated so terrifyingly fast that Zimbardo, who had also lost himself in the role of the prison superintendent, was forced to prematurely cancel the 2-week study after just 6 agonizing days.
The parallels to real-world atrocities are unavoidable here. The material explicitly connects the psychology of this experiment to the horrific abuses committed by American military guards at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq.
It also mentions how the Greek military junta in the 1970s managed to train ordinary, decent young men to become ruthless torturers.
How do they do that?
They use the foot in the door escalation. First, the recruit just stands guard outside the door of the interrogation room. Then he is brought inside the room just to watch. Then he is ordered to strike a minor blow. Before he realizes what is happening, he is actively participating in torture.
Again, what we do, we gradually become.
However, we have to insert a crucial psychological asterisk here. The situation is incredibly powerful, but human beings are not just passive robots. Person and situation constantly interact.
Right, not everyone breaks.
Exactly. Not every guard at Abu Ghraib committed abuses. Not every participant in Zimbardo's study became sadistic. As the text eloquently puts it, in a watery situation, salt dissolves, but sand does not. Some people's internal dispositions are like sand. They actively resist the corrosive power of a bad situation.
Okay, so we've established that acting against our beliefs eventually changes our beliefs. But we still need to understand the biological and cognitive engine driving this. Why does it happen?
Like, why can't we just act one way and think another without our brain short-circuiting?
Right. And this brings us to Leon Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory.
Cognitive dissonance is the psychological and physical discomfort we experience when two of our thoughts are inconsistent, or when our attitudes completely clash with our actions.
We really like to view ourselves as rational, consistent beings.
We do. Let's say you believe you are a profoundly honest person, but you just told a major lie to a friend to protect your own ego. That creates a violent internal friction. It is an actual biological stress response.
Your brain hates that tension just as much as it hates hunger or thirst.
And it is desperate to resolve it. But you can't undo the physical action. The lie has already been told. So, to alleviate the internal stress, your brain takes the path of least resistance. It changes your attitude to align with the action.
You rationalize it. You say, well, I didn't really lie. I just protected their feelings. Honestly, it did a good thing. And boom, the dissonance vanishes.
The classic laboratory proof of this is the famous $2 essay experiment. You bring a student into a lab and make them do an incredibly boring, soul-crushing task for an hour, like turning wooden pegs on a board.
Sounds awful.
Then you ask them to lie to the next participant sitting in the waiting room. You ask them to say, hey, the experiment was actually really fun and exciting.
Now you offer half the students $20 to tell the lie. The other half, you only offer $2.
Right.
See, this is where my intuition is totally backwards. I would assume the person paid $20 would be more likely to actually believe the lie because they got a bigger reward.
That is the logical assumption. But dissonance operates on justification. The person who lied for $20 experiences very little dissonance. They know they lied, but they have massive external justification.
They say, yeah, the task was boring and I lied, but I did it for $20.
Exactly. Their internal attitude about the task doesn't need to change. But the person who lied for $2 isn't enough external justification to compromise your integrity, so they experience massive cognitive dissonance.
They think, I am an honest person, but I just lied to a stranger for a measly $2. That makes me look cheap and foolish.
And to eliminate that terrible feeling, their brain creates internal justification. They unconsciously rewrite their own memory. They say, you know what? The peg-turning task wasn't that bad. It was actually kind of meditative and interesting.
They literally change their belief to match their behavior, all to soothe the dissonance.
That is mind-bending. And it scales up to massive historical events, too. The material applies this directly to the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. The primary explicit justification for the war was the imminent threat of weapons of mass destruction.
Most Americans supported the invasion based on that specific premise. But when the military secured the country, the WMDs were not found.
Which created a societal-level wave of cognitive dissonance. The country had just committed enormous financial resources, and thousands of lives had been lost or shattered for a premise that turned out to be false.
The psychological pain of that inconsistency is unbearable. So how does a whole society reduce the dissonance?
They revised their memories and shift their rationale. Once it became clear the WMDs didn't exist, public discourse and political messaging rapidly pivoted. The justification for the war shifted from finding imminent weapons to liberating an oppressed people from a brutal dictator and planting the seeds of democracy in the Middle East.
The action, the invasion, couldn't be undone. So the attitude and the stated purpose evolved to justify the reality on the ground.
It sounds incredibly manipulative, but there is A deeply optimistic, almost therapeutic takeaway here for you as a listener.
I'm glad there's a bright side.
If you accept that your attitudes follow your behavior, you can literally reverse engineer your own mind. The text quotes Shakespeare's Hamlet, who tells his mother, "Assume a virtue if you have it not."
So if you are feeling unloving toward your partner, don't wait for the feeling to magically return. Act loving. Make them coffee. Speak kindly.
The physical behavior will create dissonance with your unloving attitude, and your brain will resolve it by generating the feeling of love to match your kind actions. You can change who you are by changing what you do.
It is a profound realization of our own agency, and it serves as the perfect bridge from social thinking to our second major pillar, which is social influence. We've spent all this time examining the internal gears of the mind. Now, we need to look at what happens when the mere physical presence of other human beings starts yanking on our social strengths.
And that unseen influence begins at the most basic biological level with the chameleon effect. This is a phenomenon documented by Tanya Chartrand and John Bargh. Humans are unconscious mimics.
Right. If you put a college student in a room to work on a test, and you have an undercover researcher sit across from them, the student's body will automatically mirror the researcher.
If the researcher rubs their face, the student rubs their face. If the researcher shakes their foot, the student shakes their foot.
It is entirely involuntary, and it's driven by our neural architecture, specifically mirror neurons. But it's not just a parlor trick. It serves a deep evolutionary purpose.
Physical mimicry breeds emotional synchrony. When we adopt the posture or facial expressions of the people around us, we actually begin to feel what they are feeling. It is the biological foundation of empathy.
Why we experience mood linkage. You walk into a room of depressed people, and your own energy crashes. You walk into a room of laughing people, and you feel lighter.
But empathy has a dark side. Suggestibility isn't just about sharing yawns or smiles. It can be lethally contagious.
Yeah, the material notes that in the 8 days immediately following the Columbine High School shooting, almost every single U.S. state experienced a surge of copycat bomb threats and violence.
Furthermore, suicides are tragically prone to contagion. When Marilyn Monroe took her own life in August of 1962, the intense media coverage acted as a massive social cue, and the United States suicide count jumped by 200 that month.
People on the brink were pushed over the edge by the highly publicized actions of another.
Which brings us to the terrifying question of conformity. If we are biologically wired to mimic each other, how susceptible are we to the pressure of a group, even when the group is demonstrably objectively wrong?
Solomon Asch answered this in 1955 with what is arguably one of the most famous experiments in psychology. I want to paint the picture of this room for you, the listener, because the psychological tension is just agonizing.
Oh, it's so uncomfortable.
Imagine you volunteer for a study on visual perception. You walk into a drab university room and sit at the end of a long table. There are 5 other participants already seated. The researcher stands up and shows the group a card with a single standard line on it. Then, he shows a second card with 3 comparison lines. He asks everyone to simply say out loud which of the 3 comparison lines matches the standard line in length.
It is important to emphasize here, this is not an optical illusion. It is not a trick question. Line 2 is obviously blatantly the exact same length. A child could get it right.
Right, so the researcher asks the first person, but the first person says confidently, line 3. You sit there and think, are they blind? Line 3 is way too short. But then the second person says line 3. The third person says line 3. The fourth, the fifth. Everyone gives the exact same, unequivocally wrong answer.
And now all eyes are on you.
Your heart is hammering in your chest,
Yeah.
with absolute sensory certainty that the answer is line 2. But to say that out loud means standing entirely alone against a unanimous group. Do you trust your own eyes or do you conform?
The results were staggering. When participants took this test alone, they were wrong less than 1% of the time. But when subjected to the pressure of the unanimous group, over 1/3 of the time, these intelligent, capable college students folded.
They essentially looked at a white wall and called it black just to avoid breaking rank with the group.
They really did.
Why does our brain betray our own eyes like that?
Because for our ancestors, social exclusion was a death sentence. If your entire tribe is running away from a wrestling bush and you decide to stand there and investigate, you get eaten by the tiger. We are wired to assume the group knows something we don't.
Asch found that conformity spikes under very specific conditions, too.
Yeah, like when we are made to feel incompetent or insecure, or when the group consists of at least 3 people. Because 2 people is just a pair of weirdos, but 3 people is a pattern.
Also, when the group is completely unanimous, and when we admire the group's status or attractiveness. The material breaks down why we conform into two distinct categories. The first is normative social influence.
This is when we conform simply to avoid social rejection or to gain approval. We aren't changing our internal belief, we are just paying the social tax.
It's why you don't wear a swimsuit to a funeral, or why you wear a tailored suit on Wall Street but a hoodie in Silicon Valley. We are terrified of the social penalty of being the odd one out.
The second category is much deeper: informational social influence. This is when we conform because we actually accept the group's behavior as evidence of reality. We assume the group possesses superior information.
The text shares a wild anecdote about an English woman named Rebecca Denton. She drove 30 miles on the wrong side of a divided British highway. She later explained that she thought the hundreds of cars swerving and honking at her were all driving on the wrong side of the road.
Her internal reality was so strong she ignored the informational influence of hundreds of people. But usually, we fold.
Robert Barron demonstrated this perfectly by modernizing Ash's experiment. Instead of matching lines, he had students look at a picture of a suspect and then try to pick that suspect out of a police lineup. But he manipulated the stakes.
He made the task either incredibly easy by letting them view the lineup for a full 5 seconds, or impossibly difficult by flashing it for only half a second.
And he also manipulated the importance. Half the students were told it was just a meaningless preliminary test. The other half were told their data was vital for establishing real police procedures, and they would be paid $20 if they were accurate.
Right.
So if you make it difficult and important, people will try harder and trust themselves more.
Right.
The exact opposite. When the task was easy, people almost never conformed, even when it was important. They knew the answer, so they stood their ground. But when the task was impossibly difficult, meaning they were highly uncertain of the reality and the judgment was highly important, conformity skyrocketed.
They deferred to the group's wrong answers over 50% of the time. When we are unsure and the stakes are high, our brain begs the group to tell us what is real. Conformity is insidious because it is a passive pressure. But what happens when that pressure becomes an active, direct command? What happens when an authority figure orders you to cause catastrophic pain to another human being?
This takes us to Stanley Milgram, a student of Ash, who designed what is universally considered the most famous, controversial, and deeply unsettling experiment in the history of psychology.
The obedience studies.
Again, let's put you, the listener, right in the chair. You answer a newspaper ad and arrive at a laboratory at Yale University. You are told you are participating in a pioneering study on the effects of punishment on learning. You draw a slip of paper from a hat, and you are assigned the role of the teacher.
And a friendly, mild-mannered man in his 50s draws the role of the learner. You watch as the learner is taken into the adjacent room, strapped firmly into a chair, and wired to an electrode.
Now the twist is that the drawing was rigged. The learner is an actor working for Milgram. The shocks are completely fake. But you, the teacher, have no idea. You are given a real 45-volt shock just to prove the machine works.
You sit in front of a massive shock generator. It has 30 switches, ranging from 15 volts, labeled slight shock, all the way up to 450 volts, ominously labeled XX.
Your job is to read word pairs to the learner over an intercom. Every time he gets an answer wrong, you must flip the next switch, increasing the voltage by 15 volts.
As the experiment begins, the learner gets answers wrong. You flip the switches, 15 volts, 30 volts, it seems fine. But at 75 volts, you hear the learner grunt in pain through the wall.
At 120 volts, he shouts that the shocks are becoming painful. At 150 volts, he demands to be let out, screaming that his heart is bothering him.
At this point, almost every participant hesitates. You look back at the experimenter, a stern man in a gray lab coat holding a clipboard. You say, I think we need to stop. He's in pain.
But the experimenter just looks at you and delivers a scripted prod. Please continue. If you hesitate again, he says, the experiment requires that you continue. Then it is absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, you have no other choice. You must go on.
At 330 volts, the learner's screams become agonizing. He refuses to answer any more questions. The experimenter coldly instructs you to treat silence as an incorrect answer and deliver the next shock. Eventually, the room next door goes completely, deathly silent.
The ultimate question of the human condition. How far do you go? Before he ran the study, Milgram asked 40 psychiatrists to predict the results. They overwhelmingly agreed that most people would stop as soon as the learner protested.
They thought only
That is the dispositional attribution talking. Your brain is looking at the car in the mud and blaming the engine.
Wow, yeah, you're right.
Milgram wasn't studying bad apples. He was studying the barrel. He manipulated the variables to find out when obedience was highest. He found that compliance skyrocketed when the person giving the orders was physically close by and perceived as a legitimate authority figure.
It spiked because the study was backed by a prestigious institution like Yale. It spiked because the victim was depersonalized, hidden in another room. And critically, it was highest when there were no other role models for defiance. When our participants saw another teacher rebel, they almost always rebelled too.
And we also have to connect this back to what we learned earlier. Milgram weaponized the foot-in-the-door phenomenon. He didn't start the experiment by telling them to administer 450 volts of lethal electricity. He asked them to administer 15 volts. The tickle.
Right. When you administer 15 volts, how do you justify stopping at 30? When you've justified 150, what's another 15 volts to get to 165? The psychological slope is so gentle that participants trap themselves in their own escalating compliance.
As Milgram synthesized it himself, ordinary people, simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terribly destructive process. When the human desire to be kind collides with the deeply ingrained habit of obeying authority, obedience usually wins. It is a sobering, devastating truth.
Let's step back from direct obedience and look at a broader, subtler form of group influence. How does merely having an audience change how we perform?
In 1898, a psychologist named Norman Triplett noticed that bicycle racers consistently clocked faster times when they were racing against other humans compared to racing alone against a clock.
To test this, he had adolescents win fishing reels as fast as they could. They wound significantly faster when another child was doing the same task next to them. This phenomenon is called social facilitation.
But the mechanism here isn't just that people make us better. The mechanism is physiological arousal. The presence of other people pumps adrenaline into our system. It arouses us.
And arousal always strengthens our most likely response. If you are doing a task that is incredibly easy or something you have masterfully practiced, like a professional athlete shooting a free throw or a teenager driving away from a stoplight, your most likely response is success. So the audience facilitates and boosts your performance.
But if the task is incredibly difficult, or you are terrible at it, say trying to parallel park in front of a patio full of people watching you, or trying to solve a complex math problem on a chalkboard,
And your most likely response is failure. The arousal amplifies your anxiety, and the presence of the audience severely hinders your performance. You freeze up.
now that's when you are being individually evaluated. But what about when we pool our efforts toward a common goal, like a massive group project in an office, or playing tug-of-war?
This introduces the exact opposite problem, social loafing. When people pull together in a group and individual accountability is erased, they consistently exert less effort than when they are working alone.
It's the diffusion of responsibility. If you were one of 10 people pulling a rope, you unconsciously calculate that your individual effort won't make or break the outcome, and nobody can tell exactly how hard you were pulling anyway. So you slack off, you loaf.
Now, here is where social psychology gets volatile. What happens when you combine the intense arousal of social facilitation with the diminished personal responsibility of social loafing?
You get a dangerous psychological cocktail called de-individuation. This occurs when group participation makes people both highly aroused and completely anonymous. When people are de-individuated, they abandon their normal self-restraint.
They lose their sense of individual identity and fuse with the mob. This single mechanism explains everything from why a polite teenager will suddenly throw a chair in a massive cafeteria food fight, to why seemingly normal citizens will loot a store during a riot, to why anonymous users on the internet will hurl vicious death threats they would never dream of saying to someone's face.
The mask of the group removes the consequences.
The group provides a cloak of anonymity. But groups don't just act, they also deliberate. They make decisions. And the material explores a phenomenon called group polarization.
The logical assumption is that if you put a bunch of people in a room to discuss an issue, the various opinions will moderate each other and they will reach a balanced compromise.
But reality shows the opposite. If you put a group of like-minded people together to discuss a topic they already agree on, their existing attitudes will dramatically intensify.
The text highlights a fascinating real-world experiment involving deliberative polling in Colorado. Researchers brought together groups of citizens in liberal Boulder and conservative Colorado Springs. They spent a day discussing hot-button issues like climate change and same-sex unions with their ideologically similar peers.
Let me guess. The echo chamber worked its magic.
Completely. After the deliberation, the people in Boulder didn't moderate. They moved significantly further to the political left. The people in Colorado Springs moved significantly further to the right. Ideological separation plus deliberation equals polarization.
When you only hear arguments that validate your existing worldview, your beliefs calcify into extremes.
Which paves the way for the executive disaster known as groupthink. This happens in boardrooms and government cabinets all the time. Groupthink is a disease of decision-making.
It occurs when the desire for harmony and consensus within a group becomes so overwhelming that it actively suppresses dissenting views and realistic alternatives. Everyone is so desperate to be on the same page that nobody points out that the page is on fire.
We saw this in the lead-up to the Bay of Pigs invasion or the Challenger space shuttle disaster. People had doubts, but the group dynamic demanded loyalty over accuracy.
The text notes that the only way for leaders to inoculate their teams against groupthink is to actively invite expert critiques from outside the bubble and to explicitly assign people the role of devil's advocate, making dissent a mandatory part of the process rather than a social faux pas.
Zooming out from the boardroom to the macro level, we have cultural influence. Culture is the ultimate group dynamic. It is the shared behaviors, ideas, attitudes, values, and traditions transmitted from one generation to the next.
It provides the invisible scaffolding of our lives, the norms, the unwritten rules for accepted behavior. We don't even realize how intensely culture governs us until we travel and realize that the comfortable physical distance for a conversation in America feels entirely invasive in Japan or uncomfortably distant in Latin America.
And the most stunning aspect of culture is its velocity. Biological evolution takes hundreds of thousands of years. But the Maturi points out that since 1960, Western culture has undergone tectonic shifts. We've seen massive increases in the middle class, a revolution in women entering the workforce, and historic expansions of human rights.
But simultaneously, we've seen skyrocketing rates of divorce, teen suicide, and depression, and a culture where people work longer hours while sleeping significantly less.
That rapid transformation proves that our behavior isn't just dictated by our DNA. We are deeply sculpted by the specific cultural moment we are born into. However, the text ensures we don't walk away feeling entirely powerless.
Right. Social control and personal control are in a constant dance. We are not just sheep. A committed, unwavering numerical minority can actually sway a majority.
If a minority consistently expresses its views without yielding, it creates enough friction to force the majority to pause and rethink its deeply held assumptions. History is driven by the power of the committed minority,
which serves as a necessary anchor as we move into the final and perhaps most complex pillar of the unit. Social relations. We've looked at how we think and how we are influenced. Now, how do we relate to one another when the barriers are down?
And psychologically, we must begin by examining the darkest fractures in our social relations, which are prejudice and aggression. Let's clearly define our terms here. Prejudice literally means prejudgment. It is an unjustifiable, usually negative attitude toward an entire group of people.
And it is a three-legged stool. It relies on beliefs, which are usually oversimplified stereotypes. It relies on negative emotions like fear or hostility. And it results in a predisposition to action, which manifests in the real world as discrimination. Prejudice is the attitude. Discrimination is the behavior.
And the text makes a vital distinction about the evolution of prejudice. If you look at polling over the last several decades, overt, blatant prejudice, the kind enshrined in segregationist laws or expressed proudly in public, has drastically waned. Approval rates for interracial marriage and women in political leadership have skyrocketed.
But the psychology warns us that while overt prejudice has receded, subtle, automatic, often unconscious prejudice is still deeply embedded in our neural networks.
To understand why prejudice is so stubborn, we have to look at the psychological mechanics of how we form our identity. We are desperate to belong. We define who we are partly by the groups we attach ourselves to, our social identity.
Automatically, we draw a mental circle. Everyone inside the circle is us, the ingroup. Everyone outside the circle is them, the outgroup.
And the second that circle is drawn, the brain generates ingroup bias. It is an immediate automatic favoring of our own group. We will allocate more resources, more empathy, and more forgiveness to people inside the circle.
And here is the bizarre irony. We often reserve our most intense venom for the groups that are most similar to us, but who exist just slightly outside our circle. Sigmund Freud called this the narcissism of small differences.
He noted that the South German can endure the North German, the English despise the Scots. It's why fans of rival sports teams in the same city will literally fight each other in the parking lot.
From an emotional standpoint, prejudice is also heavily fueled by scapegoat theory. When things go wrong in a society, an economic depression, a pandemic, a lost war, frustration rapidly breeds anger.
And anger is a volatile energy that desperately seeks a target. It is psychologically agonizing to accept that sometimes bad things happen due to complex, uncontrollable systemic failures. It is much easier to find a powerless outgroup and blame them. The scapegoat provides a tangible outlet for the societal rage.
But beyond the emotional need to blame, there are purely cognitive roots to prejudice. It is a terrifying byproduct of how our brains naturally function. The world is too complex to process individually, so our brains aggressively categorize. We categorize objects, animals, and unfortunately, people.
But when we categorize human beings, we fall into a cognitive trap.
Yeah.
We perceive outgroup homogeneity.
Exactly. Because we live inside our own group, we recognize how beautifully diverse and nuanced we are. But because we only look at the outgroup from a distance, our brain flattens them into a monolith. We literally perceive that they all look and act exactly alike.
This manifests biologically as the other race effect, or own race bias. Our brains are empirically better at recognizing and distinguishing individual faces from our own racial group than from other races, simply because of categorization and familiarity.
Our memories also betray us through vivid cases. The text describes an experiment by Myron Rothbard. They showed two groups of students' lists containing information about 50 men. For one group, 10 of the men had committed nonviolent crimes, like forgery. For the second group, 10 of the men had committed horrifying violent crimes, like assault and murder.
Later, when asked to estimate how many men on the list had committed any sort of crime, the second group massively overestimated the number. Because violent, vivid cases act like flares in our memory, we unconsciously take those extreme examples and overgeneralize them to represent the entire group.
And perhaps the most insidious cognitive trap of all is the just world phenomenon. From the time we are toddlers reading fairy tales, we are taught that good is rewarded and evil is punished.
But as adults, we unconsciously reverse that logic. We assume that if someone is suffering, they must have done something bad to deserve it. It is the psychological engine of victim blaming.
It is a defense mechanism. If the world is random, then wealthy, successful people might just be lucky, and they could lose it all tomorrow. That is terrifying. But if the world is just, then the wealthy earned their wealth, and the poor earned their poverty.
The text uses a chilling historical example. A civilian visiting the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp shortly after World War II looked at the emaciated victims and remarked, "What terrible criminals these prisoners must have been to receive such treatment." The brain will literally blame Holocaust victims before it accepts that the world is inherently unjust.
It is a devastating reality of human cognition, and this cognitive prejudice frequently boils over into actual aggression. Psychologically, aggression is defined very strictly. It is any physical or verbal behavior intended to hurt or destroy. A dentist causing you pain isn't aggressive. A rumor started to ruin someone's reputation is.
And aggression is a classic biopsychosocial phenomenon. We have to look at the biology first. Genetics definitely load the gun. We have specific neural systems in the brain that facilitate aggression.
The text mentions a startling experiment where researchers implanted an electrode in the amygdala, the brain's emotion center, of a mild-mannered woman. When they flipped a switch to stimulate that specific region, she instantly snarled and physically attacked her doctor.
Conversely, we know that diminished activity in the frontal lobes, which act as the brain's braking system for impulses, is a common neurological marker in violent criminals.
Biochemically, hormones act as an accelerant. High levels of testosterone correlate heavily with aggression, irritability, and impulsiveness. And alcohol is arguably the most potent chemical catalyst. It unleashes aggressive responses to provocation by disinhibiting the brain and skewing our perception, making us interpret ambiguous actions as hostile.
But biology is just the foundation. Psychology pulls the trigger. The most famous psychological trigger is the frustration-aggression principle. Frustration is the miserable feeling of being blocked from a goal. That frustration instantly generates anger, and anger can rapidly spark violent aggression.
The text uses a perfect sports example. In baseball, if a batter hits a home run, the pitcher is intensely frustrated. Data shows that the pitcher is significantly more likely to aggressively hit the next batter with a 90-mile-an-hour fastball. The frustration demanded a physical outlet.
Even environmental stress triggers this principle. The material notes that violent crime rates demonstrably spike during intense heat waves. As temperatures soar in cities like Houston, Texas, aggressive behavior rises right alongside the thermometer. The physical discomfort acts as chronic frustration.
Socially, the environment teaches us aggression. Higher violence rates are linked to factors like minimal father care, which creates instability. But the text spends a massive amount of time dissecting the influence of the media, the eternal debate. Does watching violence cause violence?
The psychological consensus leans heavily toward yes, through two mechanisms, desensitization and the learning of social scripts. When we repeatedly witness violence, our emotional response blunts.
Zellman and Bryant conducted an experiment where they showed men repeatedly sexually explicit X-rated films featuring sexual violence. Afterward, those men recommended significantly shorter prison sentences for a convicted rapist in a mock trial compared to a control group. The heavy consumption of violent pornography had literally desensitized their moral outrage toward sexual violence.
And media also provides us with social scripts. A social script is basically a mental tape our culture provides on how to act in novel situations. If a young person grows up watching primetime television and action movies where the hero solves every conflict by punching the villain in the face, they internalize that script. When they face a real-life conflict at school, their brain boots up the script. Act like a man, use physical dominance.
This brings us to the highly scrutinized topic of violent video games. Anderson and Dill conducted studies showing that university men who spent the most time playing violent video games were objectively the most physically aggressive.
In laboratory experiments, participants who played a hyper-violent game like Mortal Kombat, compared to those who played a peaceful puzzle game like Myst, exhibited increased hostility. When given the chance, the Mortal Kombat players were much more likely to punish their peers by blasting them with intense, painful bursts of noise.
And we really need to emphasize this because it completely disconfirms a very popular cultural myth, the catharsis hypothesis. We hear this justification all the time. Oh, playing violent games or punching a heavy bag is good for you. It lets you blow off steam and vent your anger so you don't use it in real life.
The psychological data definitively says otherwise. Expressing anger breeds more anger. By acting aggressively in a game, you are not venting a reservoir of rage. You are actually practicing and reinforcing the neural pathways of aggression. Practicing violence breeds more violence.
Okay, we have waded through the absolute darkest parts of human nature. Let's finally pivot toward the light. What are the forces that pull us together? The psychology of attraction. What exactly sparks a friendship or a sweeping romantic romance?
The irony of romance is that we like to think it's guided by destiny or cosmic alignment. But practically, it starts with something laughably mundane. Proximity, geographical nearness. Statistically, you are overwhelmingly likely to marry or befriend someone who lives in your neighborhood, works in your building, or sits next to you in class.
It's all about the mere exposure effect, the simple reality that familiarity breeds fondness. The more we are exposed to a novel stimulus, a song, a piece of art, or a human face, the more we grow to like it.
The text cites a brilliant experiment by Moreland and Beach. They had 4 equally attractive women attend a large college lecture class, but they varied their attendance. One woman never went, one went to 5 classes, 1 to 10, and one silently attended 15 sessions.
At the end of the semester, the students were shown pictures of the women and asked to rate their attractiveness. The results were perfectly linear. The woman they had simply seen the most often was rated the most attractive.
Again, we have to look to our evolutionary ancestors for the why. For early humans, what was familiar was generally safe. The people in your tribe were familiar. What was unfamiliar, a stranger from another tribe, a strange animal, was highly dangerous. We are hardwired by evolution to feel a warm glow toward anything that is familiar because familiarity historically meant survival.
So proximity gets you in the room. What happens next? The text addresses the elephant in the room. Physical attractiveness. How much do looks actually matter in first impressions?
Enormously. Whether we want to admit it or not, physical attractiveness is the primary predictor of initial social success. But the standards of beauty are a fascinating mix of culture and biology.
Cultural standards change wildly over time, from valuing fuller figures in the Renaissance to extreme thinness in the 1990s. But across all cultures, human beings universally prefer faces that are highly symmetrical.
And paradoxically, we prefer faces that are averaged. If you take a computer and blend 30 different faces together, people will rate the mathematically average composite as more attractive than almost any of the individual faces. Symmetrical, average features unconsciously signal a lack of genetic abnormalities and robust health.
But looks only get you past the first date. What sustains a relationship? There is a massive cultural cliche that opposites attract. The rebel falls for the valedictorian.
It makes for great cinema, but terrible psychology. The text is definitive on this. In real life, opposites attract. Birds of a feather flock together is the psychological reality. We are overwhelmingly attracted to people who share our attitudes, our beliefs, our interests, our age, and our economic background.
Similarity breeds content. The more alike two people are, the more likely their liking will endure.
And when that liking ignites into romantic love, researcher Elaine Hatfield provides a framework for how it evolves. She distinguishes between two distinct stages. The first is passionate love. This is the honeymoon phase. It is an intensely aroused state of total absorption in each other.
It relies on the two-factor theory of emotion. You have intense physical arousal, your heart is racing, you have butterflies, and your cognitive appraisal attributes all of that overwhelming physical arousal to the presence of this specific person.
But biology won't allow passionate love to last forever. The physical arousal inevitably subsides. If the relationship is going to survive, it must mature into companionate love. This is a deep, steady, affectionate attachment. It intertwines your lives, and the text highlights two vital ingredients required to achieve this enduring stage.
The first is equity. This is the condition where both partners receive in proportion to what they give. It's about sharing the burdens of life, the chores, the emotional support, and the joy. If a relationship lacks equity, resentment quickly replaces love.
The second vital ingredient is self-disclosure. This is the brave act of revealing intimate, vulnerable details about ourselves, our deep likes, our embarrassing dislikes, our dreams, our darkest worries. Sharing that vulnerability builds profound trust. And interestingly, as that deep emotional intimacy increases through self-disclosure, it can actually serve to occasionally rekindle the physical spark of that initial passionate love.
Okay, we understand romantic attachment, but what about our relation to the rest of humanity? What makes us step up and sacrifice our own comfort or even our safety to help a total stranger? This is the psychology of altruism.
And the text anchors this entire section with a story that traumatized the nation, the tragic murder of Kitty Genovese. In 1964, she was attacked by a man with a knife outside her apartment building in Queens, New York. She screamed for help. Reports at the time stated that 38 of her neighbors heard her screams. Lights went on, windows went up. The attacker even briefly fled. But the neighbors went back to sleep. He returned, stalked her, and ultimately murdered her. And not a single person called the police until the attacker had fled for good, far too late.
The media narrative immediately condemned this city. They called it urban apathy. They said New Yorkers were cold, soulless monsters. But social psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané looked past the dispositional attributions. They recognized the horrific power of the situation. They identified what we now call the bystander effect.
They broke down the psychology of helping into a three-step decision scheme. To intervene in an emergency, we must clear three distinct cognitive hurdles. First, we must actually notice the incident. Second, we must interpret it as a genuine emergency. And third, we must assume personal responsibility for helping.
And here is the tragic paradox. At every single one of those three steps, the physical presence of other people dilutes our reaction. If you are walking down a crowded street, you are less likely to notice someone slumped in a doorway than if you were alone. If you do notice them, you look around at the crowd. If everyone else is walking by looking blasé, informational social influence kicks in, and you interpret the situation as a non-emergency. Oh, he must just be sleeping.
And even if you clear the first two hurdles, even if you know for a fact it is an emergency, like hearing Kitty Genovese scream, the presence of others creates a diffusion of responsibility. Your brain makes a fatal calculation. There are 37 other people looking out their windows. Someone else has definitely already called 911. I don't need to get involved. Because everyone shares the responsibility, no one single person feels the burden to act.
The data is undeniable. The best odds of receiving help occur when the person in need appears to truly deserve it, when they're similar to us, when we are not in a hurry, when we are in a good mood, and crucially, when there are very few other bystanders around to diffuse the responsibility.
But when we do finally step up and help, why do we do it? What is the underlying motivation? The text offers three main theories. The most cynical is social exchange theory. This argues that all human interactions are essentially economic transactions. We are constantly doing a subconscious cost-benefit analysis. We help only if the anticipated rewards, like social approval, reducing our own guilt, or receiving public praise, exceed the costs of our time, money, or safety.
But we are also driven by deeply ingrained societal norms. The reciprocity norm is the universal expectation that we should return help to those who have helped us. It is the social glue of favors. But the most noble is the social responsibility norm. This is the deeply held belief that we have a moral obligation to help those who are highly dependent and in need, like young children, the elderly, or the injured, even if the costs vastly outweigh the benefits.
This norm is the engine of true heroism. The text shares the breathtaking story of Wesley Autry. He was standing on a crowded New York subway platform with his two little girls. A stranger standing nearby had a massive seizure and collapsed onto the tracks right as the headlights of an oncoming train appeared in the tunnel. Autry didn't do a cost-benefit analysis. Driven by the social responsibility norm, he leaped from the platform, shoved the convulsing man down into the narrow trench between the rails, and lay flat on top of him as 5 train cars screeched to a halt literal inches above his head. He risked absolutely everything for a total stranger.
It is the ultimate antidote to the darkness of the Milgram experiments. It proves what we are capable of. But as we move into our final section on conflict and peacemaking, we have to acknowledge that heroism is rare. Much more often, our goals clash with the goals of others. A conflict is simply a perceived incompatibility of actions, goals, or ideas, and often these conflicts escalate into disaster because we fall into social traps.
A social trap is a situation where pursuing our own immediate logical self-interest guarantees mutual destruction for everyone involved.
The material illustrates this using a classic game theory matrix. Imagine you and another player are put in separate rooms. You both have to choose option A or option B. If you both choose A, you cooperate and you both win $5. Not bad. But if you choose B, which is the selfish option, and the other person chooses A, you win $10 and they get 0.
So, purely mathematically, the temptation is to choose B. You want to maximize your own payout.
Exactly, but the trap snaps shut because the other person is doing the exact same math. If you both pursue your immediate self-interest and choose B, the matrix dictates that you both get 0. By trying to win it all, you both lose everything. We see this constantly in the real world. Commercial fishing fleets overhunt endangered whale populations to maximize their short-term profits, leading to the collapse of the entire species, destroying the industry for everyone, or individuals buy massive gas-guzzling vehicles for their own personal comfort, collectively emitting greenhouse gases that accelerate global climate change, ruining the planet for everyone. Individual rationality leads to collective suicide.
And once we are locked in these conflicts, our perception of the enemy becomes entirely untethered from reality. We develop mirror image perceptions, we look across the conflict and see them as evil, untrustworthy, aggressive demons, and we see ourselves as peaceful, righteous victims simply defending ourselves.
But because it's a mirror, they see us in the exact same demonic light. These perceptions inevitably become self-fulfilling prophecies. They lock both sides into an endless cycle of retaliation, where every action is justified as a defense. The text highlights a fascinatingly simple experiment from University College London that explains why conflicts inevitably escalate. They had pairs of volunteers hook their fingers to a mechanical device. The rule was simple: reciprocate the exact same amount of finger pressure that your partner just applied to you, tit for tat.
But human perception is flawed.
Wildly flawed. The volunteers consistently responded with 40% more force than they had actually received, because the pressure applied to them felt harder than it was. So a gentle tap quickly escalated into a painful squeeze. In real-world conflicts, both sides genuinely believe they are just evening the score, but because they over-retaliate, the violence spirals out of control.
So we are trapped in the matrix, hitting each other 40% harder every time.
Yeah.
How do social psychologists suggest we actually fix it? They propose the 4 C's of peacemaking.
The first is contact. Putting conflicting groups in close proximity can help, but only if they are of equal status and the contact is non-competitive. Just forcing enemies into the same room usually just leads to shouting.
Which is why contact requires the second C, cooperation. And the vital tool for cooperation is the introduction of superordinate goals.
Superordinate goals are massive shared objectives that completely override existing differences and demand the absolute cooperation of both sides to achieve. The text uses the example of post-genocide Rwanda. To heal the unimaginable historic animosity between the Tutsis and the Hutus, the country had to focus on a new, superordinate shared identity, the goal of building a unified Rwandan nation. Or, on a global scale, Al Gore famously noted that the existential threat of climate change acts as a superordinate goal. It doesn't matter what your geopolitical grievances are, if the planet burns, everyone dies. The universal threat requires a common bond.
But before we can cooperate, we have to talk. The third C is communication. When tensions are boiling and mirror image perceptions are locked in, the parties are often too angry to speak rationally. This is where third-party mediators become essential. A skilled mediator changes the psychological framing of a conflict. They take a competitive win-lose situation and force the parties to communicate their underlying needs to find a cooperative win-win resolution.
The material uses a wonderful simplistic analogy to explain this. Two friends are bitterly fighting over a single orange. Neither will yield. So they compromise and simply cut the orange in half. They both walk away, mildly unhappy. One friend takes his half, squeezes the fruit for juice, and throws away the peel. The other friend takes his half, grates the peel to bake a cake, and throws away the fruit.
It's a tragedy of poor communication. If they had used a mediator to communicate their underlying motives, one wanted juice, one wanted peel, they could have achieved a true win-win. One could have had all the juice and the other all the peel.
But what if the situation is so tense that even mediation is impossible? What if two nuclear-armed nations are at a standoff? That requires the fourth C, conciliation. Specifically, a psychological strategy developed by Charles Osgood called GREET, Graduated and Reciprocated Initiatives in Tension Reduction.
When you are at the top of a tension ladder, someone has to be brave enough to take a first step down. GREET works by having one side publicly announce a mutual goal of reducing tension, followed immediately by a small, unilateral, conciliatory gesture. You don't surrender, you just offer a token of peace. You withdraw one troop regiment. You smile, you open a door.
That small gesture creates a crack in the mirror image perception. It invites the other side to reciprocate with their own small gesture. It allows both parties to slowly, safely edge down the tension ladder to a place where actual communication and cooperation can finally begin.
And that incredibly hopeful strategy brings us to the end of our journey through Unit 14. We have covered an immense amount of psychological ground today. We started by looking inward, examining the flawed detective work of our attributions and the agonizing physical tension of cognitive dissonance. We watched how the mere presence of others can force us to abandon our own eyes in Ash's conformity study or commit unthinkable acts in Milgram's obedience experiments. We stared into the cognitive traps of prejudice and the biological triggers of aggression. But we emerged on the other side, exploring the evolutionary roots of love, the breathtaking heroism of altruism, the proven psychological strategies for achieving lasting peace.
It is a sweeping, profound unit of study. It permanently shatters the illusion that we are entirely independent actors. It proves that our behavior is intensely scripted by the situations we inhabit and the people who surround us. Yet, amidst all that social pressure, it reminds us that we retain personal agency. The sand does not dissolve. We can recognize these invisible forces, and by recognizing them, we gain the power to resist unjust authority, to overcome our cognitive biases, and to actively engineer a more compassionate social reality.
Which brings me all the way back to the tension we discussed at the very beginning, the horrific violence of the box cutters on 9/11 versus the breathtaking outpourings of heroic altruism. It is all human. We contain both extremes. But we learned a foundational psychological principle today. What we do, we gradually become, and that our internal attitudes inevitably follow our physical behaviors. So I want to leave you with a completely different thought to ponder, something that pushes these concepts into the modern era. We have spent an hour talking about how the physical presence of other human beings influences us, the pressure of the room, the group, the bystander effect. But as we move deeper into a purely digital age, what happens when the room is the entire internet? When the groups we are biologically wired to conform to are no longer physical tribes, but faceless avatars and algorithmic echo chambers? How will these ancient social survival traits adapt when the entire world is watching? Who exactly are we conforming to?
That is a brilliant, unsettling question to take with you as you close the book on this unit. The medium changes, but the psychology remains.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the invisible forces that shape our lives. From the Last Minute Lecture team, we wish you the absolute best of luck in your continued study of psychology. You've got this. We'll see you next time.